So let's start. Welcome everybody to this Oxford Energy Seminar on Global Energy Perspective 2021. My name is Nick Eyre. I used to be convener of the Oxford Energy Network. My successor in that role, Phil Grunwald, is unfortunately not very well today, so he's asked me to step in to introduce the seminar. For many of you will know, this is a series that runs most weeks during Oxford University term time. This is our first session of the Hillary term, so welcome to a new term of seminars. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome two speakers from McKinsey Energy Insights, all the way from Amsterdam. It's easier these days. Bram Smeets and Alex Pfeiffer. Bram is an associate partner at McKinsey. He's chief economist for the Global Energy Perspective, which is McKinsey's outlook on the evolution of global systems. He works with clients across financial institutions, governments, and the energy sector, and previously worked at Ecofis, where he led a unit working on low carbon energy scenarios. He's got an MSc in econometrics and operations from Maastricht and a PhD in energy economics from the University Libre de Bruxelles. The second speaker is Alex Pfeiffer. This will be a joint presentation. Alex is engagement manager at McKinsey Energy Insights and solution leader for Sustainability Insights, which is McKinsey's model-backed decarbonisation advisory work. He works with clients, again, across a range of sectors, but with more of a focus on transport, e-mobility, charging, and lithium-ion batteries. That are a very interesting collection of solutions. Alex has got an MSc in Finance and Accounting from the University of Mannheim, and a good number of people on this call will know that he also has a DPhil in Geography and Environment from here in Oxford, where he worked with Cameron Hepburn in the Smith School, doing some early and still, I see, well-cited work, Alex, on stranded assets. So welcome to you both. I don't know which of you is going to start, but please feel free to share the screen and get going. I think, are you starting, Alex?
Bram will start.
Bram's starting. Okay, great. Over to you then, Bram.
Thank you very much, Nick, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to present some of our latest work to you. As you heard from Nick's introduction, both Alex and myself are have an academic background, still try to keep in touch a little bit with what the latest publications and works are there, and then in the meanwhile have now focused in a lot of our daily work also on working on the energy transition as part of McKinsey, where we continue to actually combine some of the more novel work in terms of what will the future of energy hold, what are some of the key technologies that are we going to see will enter the scene, with advising our clients on the implications and some of the big questions that this brings for their strategy. What we want to present to you today is really work that's fresh off the press. We launched our new report 2 weeks ago at the start of the year. And what we want to do today is share some of the highlights with you in, let's say, 45 minutes, and leave some time at the end also for a dialogue and open discussion. Maybe with that introduction, let me tell a little bit about the underlying methodology that we use for the work and for a lot of the results that will be shown to you today. We work on our global energy perspective, and our global energy perspective is a capability that we use with hundreds of clients, but at the core of that is actually a quite granular model that we use to project how energy systems globally are going to evolve. We do that in a lot of detail, so we cover close to 150 countries, over 30 different sectors in the economy for each of those countries, and then for all of those combinations, we cover 55 different energy products, which includes a whole range of oil products, of course, including diesel, gasoline, a lot of derivatives, natural gas, hydrogen, of course, electricity, And we use that model then as a capability to build scenarios for how we think that the future of energy can play out. And we do that in a intersection and in close collaboration with many of our direct colleagues who have similar approaches, who have gas supply models, oil supply models, downstream models, and so on. And what that gives us is an integrated suite of model perspectives that we can then use to work with a lot of our clients to help them understand, in an integrated way, how will this energy transition now unfold over the next couple of decades, and what are also some of the key sensitivities and dependencies that you need to be aware of. And we'll touch upon several of those during the presentation today. Maybe with that introduction, let me hand over to Alex, who will tell us a bit about the specific agenda and give us an overview of where we stand in the transition at this point in time.
Thank you, Bram. So for today, we have really three overarching topics that we would briefly discuss with you. On the one hand, we want to really dive deep into the energy transition as we see it today in 2020. Our outlooks currently run through 2050. So as of today, where do we see the energy transition run for the next 30 years, really? We'll then do a bit of a deep dive into the individual fuels that are at the core of this perspective, and see what's happening in the power sector, what's happening for oil, gas, and also for coal, and then ultimately end with a sort of an implications for CO2 emissions. And I think here are two angles to this. One will be now looking on a global level on our outlook on energy demand and the energy sector. Where do we end with the CO2 emissions when it comes to climate change? And then finally, how would a 1.5 degree scenario look like? At the example for the European Union, we have recently published a major report on a net zero pathway for the European Union. It was just published before Christmas, and we would want to dive into that and give an example of how that could look like. I would want to start with as of today, where do we see the energy transition go over the next 30 years? And it is actually a very exciting time to be doing this job that Bram and I luckily are able to do. Looking at the next 30 years, we have to first recognize that we look back at a decade of rapid technological change and policy shifts in the energy sector, right? So if we look at, for example, the cost of renewables, they have dropped significantly over the last 10 years. Wind has come down by 46% since 2010 in terms of cost. Solar has come down by 76%, and batteries, in particular EV, lithium-ion batteries, have come down similarly strong by 78%, right? So there's really a decade of rapid technological development. Now looking at policy, right? Over the past few years, we have, for example, seen more and more countries and regions announce targets and legislation to restrict, for example, the sale or use of internal combustion engines in certain cities. Paris is an example, Berlin is an example, I believe London is one. And really today what we see is that globally 188 million people live in cities that have in one form or the other announced ICE, so internal combustion engine restrictions by 2030. So that is really a significant driver of EV uptake around the world. But also on the fossil fuel side, right? We've seen since 2010, over only 10 years, the production of shale and oil and gas has increased by 8 times, right? Only a decade ago, there was just 4,000 kilobarrels per day production from such sources. Today, it's 30,000. So there was really a significant technological development in that time that also obviously affected energy demand, energy supply, and thereby the entire energy system in that period. And then finally, looking at climate change, global warming today exceeds 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and is expected to rise further, which with all the pressure that puts on global policymakers and companies to address this global challenge. But not only looking back 10 years was a specific exciting and also a challenging situation in this year's reference case. This is no news, but the COVID pandemic that we have seen over the past year or so, and the subsequent economic crisis with all its implications for lives and livelihoods, has also had a big effect on the energy landscape, right? Looking, for example, at the the flight activity airlines, we've seen flight activity and so RPK are revenue passenger kilometers. So the the amounts and the distances traveled by airplanes have dropped significantly over the past quarters. In particular, when you compare to sort of the pre-COVID projection, up to 90% drop in demand here, which is obviously a huge impact on the aviation industry, but also on fossil fuel industry, oil demand, etc. Looking at industry, we've seen industry production drop significantly during the crisis. It should be said, however, that as opposed to, for example, the flight activity, industry production has rebounded quite mentionably, and in many of the regions that we look at, it's almost back to where it was pre-COVID. Now, how did that affect oil? And we now picked oil because oil had the biggest had to take the biggest hit from this COVID crisis. Now, I should briefly introduce, there's two scenarios that you see here. One muted recovery, which is a scenario in which there is, a slightly longer pandemic. So the virus might mutate or the vaccination is not available that quickly. And then a slightly longer recovery. Whereas a virus contained scenario assumes that we actually handle this pandemic quite quickly. There will be a vaccine available, which luckily it looks like it might be the case, and in which we therefore will see a much quicker recovery after the crisis. So, but in both scenarios, what we expect is that oil demand will not return to what we thought it would be pre-COVID anytime over the next 5 years. So oil really took the hit significantly. Now, for our reference case, and I think this is the relevant takeaway from this sort of idea or this sort of analysis on the COVID impact. What we found is that the trends that we've seen pre-COVID already, the reduction of car park, the fuel efficiencies, the increased EV uptake, etc., has a much stronger impact on oil demand than the behavioral shifts that we could expect from now the COVID crisis. So we did model, what are likely shifts and likely behavioral changes that we now see that might sustain after the crisis. I'll give you an example, less business travel, which would affect the aviation industry again, maybe less commuting because people have now understood and seen that they can actually work from home. So they might choose to work more from home. But even if we take quite strong assumptions here, we don't see that having a very strong impact on oil demand. The other trends that we have seen already pre-COVID will have a much stronger impact on oil demand going forward. With that, I would like to hand over to Bram.
Thank you, Alex. Now, in the context of some of these rapid shifts that Alex just described, we've reflected a lot on how now best to capture the perspectives on how this energy landscape is going to evolve going forward. And what we realized there is that in the middle of the COVID crisis, but also in the middle of a rapid transition, there's clearly a lot of uncertainty about not only the direction of travel, but also the speed with which we'll continue to travel. And we've tried to capture that by introducing 4 scenarios. So there's let's say a central scenario that we refer to as the reference case, which we tend to describe as a forward-leaning continuation of existing policies. And what you need to think of there is we look at all of the governments that have made, so there's many governments who've made quite strong decarbonization targets and commitments, but we've looked then at how many of those commitments have now been caught in hard law and rules and regulations. And that, to the extent that that has happened, we capture it in a reference case. We combine that with our own proprietary perspective on how technologies will evolve, based on a deep understanding of really almost all of the sectors of the economy where we do in-depth work with clients on an everyday basis. And we bring those perspectives together to say, how will the energy system now evolve if we see a continuation of those trends? If we see that renewables continue to become cheaper, if we see that electric vehicles and batteries start or continue to drop in cost levels, and therefore we will gradually see their uptake increase, and so on. Now, in that scenario, we see a reference case where we look at emissions here expressed in gigatons. Emissions will peak somewhere in the early 2020s, 2023, and will then plateau until roughly 2028, and then start to decline. We'll talk later about some of the implications that this has. We've established 3 more scenarios then to capture this range of uncertainty that I described earlier. Let's start at the bottom. There's a 1.5 degree pathway in which we capture what needs to happen in order for the global energy system to really move to 1.5 degree pathway. And we'll talk later about what it is. The key takeaway on this page is we see there's a significant gap between where we project in our reference case emissions to end up and where the 1.5 degree pathway takes us. Then there's 2 more scenarios. There's an accelerated transition scenario and the delayed transition scenario. And those are really perspectives on what the world could look like if we see let's take the accelerated case, if we see that governments now actually use the COVID crisis and their stimulus packages in response to that in order to further accelerate the transition. So we see further support for electric vehicle uptake, we see further support for renewables uptake, and so on, combined with an accelerated technology development across a couple of key drivers. Think again of renewables, batteries, hydrogen. The delayed transition scenario is in a way an opposite development, where we say what now happens if governments actually in the context of rescue and stimulus packages focus on stimulating conventional sectors, including some of the conventional energy sectors. And then we see that scenario actually takes us to a bit higher energy demand and higher emission level. Now on the next page, we work out the difference between those scenarios a bit further. And if we start with what it looks like for power consumption, we see that in a reference case, global power demand over the next 30 years is going to more than double. Talk in a moment about some of the underlying drivers. We see that actually in a delayed transition, the outcome is not that much different. You probably see a bit less electrification, but also a bit less efficiency gains. In the accelerated transition, on the other hand, we see much stronger uptake of power demand. In the 1.5 degree pathway, we see that electrification actually is often one of the first decarbonization levers, and therefore you see a materially different power demand. If we then look at oil demand, we actually see that for oil demand, the gap or the level of variation between the scenarios is largest. So we see a reference case where by 2050 we'll have seen peak oil demand that will happen at the end of the 2020s, 2029, followed by a gradual decline. Again, we'll talk about it in a moment. But we see actually that in the accelerated transition, and particularly the 1.5 degree pathway, we see a much stronger decline in oil demand. And of course, when we say, what do you have to believe for a 1.5 degree pathway? Well, you have to believe that greenhouse gas emissions significantly drop. It's evident that will come with a decline in all of the fossil fuel and their demands. But actually, when we quantify this, one of the takeaways was this gap between what we see in a reference case and what we see in the 1.5 degree pathway, but also the accelerated transition is quite meaningful. If we then go to coal demand, we see that already in a reference case, there's a quite steady decline in coal demand from roughly 7.7 gigatons of coal today to 4.7 in a reference case, another gigaton less in the accelerated transition. And then once again, we see, of course, that in the 1.5 degree pathway, there's a tremendous gap where you need to see coal demand really drop by close to 90% by 2050. Finally, for gas demand, we find that between the 3 top scenarios, so the reference case and then the delayed transition on the one and the accelerated transition on the other, we see a rather little difference. And what it reflects is that a lot of the shifts that we're modeling for example, in the accelerated transition, where we see accelerated uptake of heat pumps, but also an accelerated shift towards electric vehicles and so on. There's actually a couple of offsetting effects if it comes to gas demand, and as a result, we see that the delta between reference case and accelerated transition demand is not so big in 2050. Then again, a 1.5 degree pathway looks materially different. Now, if we use that as an introduction into some of our perspectives by fuel, let us now look at each of those, starting with power in the next couple of pages. As I mentioned earlier, power demand in our reference case, and that's what we're looking at here, increases and more than doubles between 2019 and 2050. And if we look here at a breakdown of where those differences come from, so in other words, what are the drivers of growth and what's the role of each of the sectors in there, then we see that the building sector plays a quite steady role, and it drives close to 4,500 terawatt hours of demand increase, both between now and 2035, and then in the latter 15 years as well. And this is mainly associated with higher living standards, a growing middle class at a global level, and of course also electrification in buildings, where, for example, space heating starts to shift towards electric heat pumps. For the middle category, industry, we see actually that there's stronger electrification in the second period, and that effect is strongest actually for transport. And very interestingly, it's actually a combination of what we refer to as direct electrification, right? And direct electrification for transport means we start substituting internal combustion engines by electric vehicles. But there's also indirect electrification, where actually hydrogen is going to play a big role. And if that hydrogen is made in a sustainable green way, meaning based on electrolysis and therefore power as an input, that will of course have a significant impact also on the power demand in order to make it happen. And we see that in the second period that we're looking at here, post 2035, actually a very substantial part of the incremental power demand is going to that hydrogen production exactly. And then within transport, it's then mainly the heavy duty trucks and long haul vehicles where we see this hydrogen play a particular role. People often ask us, how is it possible then that makes up such a large share of the incremental demand here? And it's quite interesting, but when we ran the numbers, we found that even if the number of vans on the roads is relatively low compared to passenger cars, these trucks are very heavy, run very long distances, have a mileage or fuel consumption that's much higher. And as a result, in the bigger scheme of things, actually they have a very meaningful impact on the hydrogen demand that we see in this. Now, starting from the demand perspective, if we now look at how that power will be supplied, we see that the start of the revolution that we've seen over the past 10 years, and that Alex earlier alluded to, will actually continue. So we start looking in 2020, and we look going forward at 2030, 2040, 2050, we see that intermittent renewable, solar, wind onshore, wind offshore, drive more than all of the net growth that we see in power demand. And particularly solar has a very important role to play, but for all of these renewable sources, we see a massive uptake in both capacity and generation. And at the bottom of the screen, if we look at what is the share of global power that's generated based on these renewable sources, that actually increases rapidly from a bit over 1/4 today to more than 50% by 2035 and to well over 75% by 2050. And what's underlying this is actually a very bottom-up model where we look at a country level at how will power systems evolve, what is the optimal kind of cost minimization that you should think of, and that will give you optimal system costs. And so we run that for more than 80% of global power demand to come up with a perspective of, what is now actually the most cost-efficient way of expanding capacity and designing power systems. The big caveat there is that we will need to see the market design catch up as well. In other words, we need to see price setting and so on, and remuneration schemes adapt such that renewables will be stimulated, but also the flexibility that enables those renewables. So battery storage, but also gas peakers, for example, that need to be supported. Now, with that overview, let me hand over to Alex, who actually will touch upon each of the fossil fuels.
Thank you, Bram. So now looking into each of the fossil fuels in turn, I want to have a quick view at the overview of all of those first. And I think three key findings that we took away from our reference case this year, right? First finding is that the current COVID pandemic has a significant and lasting impact on the fossil fuel demand, even in 2050. You see the sort of dotted line here, which was our previous year's reference case, the pre-COVID reference case, and then the update that we just published a few weeks ago. And in 2050 and every year before, the fossil fuel demand is quite lower than what we thought it would be just a year ago. The second takeaway is that fossil fuels peak in our outlook around 2027. However, they continue to play an important role in the energy system still in 2050, despite that peak. And then the third takeaway is really all of the fossil fuels that we analyzed will peak. So coal has already peaked in 2014 and shows a steady decline. We expect oil to peak around 2029 and then decline thereafter, and gas in the mid-late 2030s with a slight decline after. So all of those fossil fuels will peak. However, again, they play an important role in the energy system still in 2050. And in particular, gas is remarkably stable. And I would like to also start now with a deep dive on gas and gas demand. So where does the gas demand over the next few years, the next few decades come from, and where is it destroyed, right? And I think what the key takeaway here is that in particular in industries, so chemicals and also the other industries where gas is used either as a feedstock or for medium and high heat generation, we see continued growth even after 2035. So here's really where gas demand continues to go up and where gas will play an important role. I think when we then look at sectors like buildings, transport, where gas, for example, plays a role some role in shipping and also refining, we see in some cases a continued growth of demand through 2035, but then a decline after 2035 when gas in these applications will increasingly be replaced with other fossil fuel free applications. An example would be that in buildings, as today a lot of the heating takes place with gas boilers, over time this will be replaced with heat pumps and other applications. And then I think the biggest sort of demand destructor in our reference case is really gas in power. So gas will lose its role as a sort of base load fuel in power generation, and instead in a power system with increasingly intermittent renewables will play a role in sort of a peaker capacity. And in particular after 2035, this really leads to a big demand destruction for natural gas. Now, looking at oil and liquids in general, we expect peak road transport oil demand to be expected really over the next few years, 2023 in our outlook here, which will then rapidly decrease afterwards, leading to a peak oil around 2029. I should say that really the biggest driver for this outlook for oil is road transport. And I will dive into that in a second. Within road transport, many of you will be aware of increasing amounts of electric vehicles that are offered by OEMs that enter the roads and that start to play a really big role. But besides the electric vehicle, we also see a big role for energy efficiency. So internal combustion engines continue to become more efficient, but also a reduction of car park growth. As many of the economies, especially in Europe and North America, start to be saturated, the car ownership will at some point level out, and we will see also less car park growth. And all of these factors lead to a slowdown of oil demand in road transport and ultimately a peaking and afterwards a reduction. We expect still by 2050 oil demand with around 94 million barrels a day to be relatively close to where it is today with 100, right? So that's a destruction of around 6 million barrels compared to today. Now, as Bram already mentioned, oil demand in our outlook has the strongest variation.
Sorry, Alex, I've muted you accidentally. Can you go back there, please?
Yes.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So I was just saying, as Bram already mentioned, oil demand has the biggest variations across scenarios, ranking from plus 15% reference case where there's delayed transition in 2050 to minus 79% oil demand in a 1.5 degrees Celsius consistent pathway as opposed to the reference case. And a lot of that, again, variation comes really from the road transport segment. What you see on this chart is where the difference comes from between our reference case, which is the white line, and the accelerated transition, which, as Bram mentioned, is a scenario in which we assume that a lot of the recovery measures for the COVID recovery will actually affect some of the energy transition trends that we've already seen. And as you can see, the biggest impact here really comes again from road transport, where we see is that a lot of the COVID recovery measures go into electric vehicle subsidies, into charging infrastructure subsidies, and so on. If we assume that this will also affect the uptake of electric vehicles, this has the potential to reduce oil demand in 2050 by 10%, that alone. There's some shifts that we see happening in aviation and maritime, where fuels are replaced by, for example, biofuels or sustainable aviation fuels and other things. And then finally, also in chemicals, where the share of plastics recycling could go up in a world that is sort of using these COVID-19 shifts to a greener recovery. In total, then leading to this quite strong destruction of oil demand in an accelerated transition scenario. Again, key takeaway here is that the road transport really has a big impact. And then finally, last of the fossil fuels, coal. I mentioned that we believe that coal has peaked in 2014. We've seen a decline since then. There was a bit of an uptake around 2018, but now in the pandemic, we really see a big dip, and we do not expect in our reference case coal demand to go back to pre-COVID levels. In particular, again, biggest driver here is demand destruction in power, where coal-fired power generation is on the decline and being increasingly replaced by gas and or renewables. There will still be quite a role for coal to play, even in 2050, for iron and steel making, in particular metallurgical coal. Final view. Even though we, as Bram mentioned, we see a strong electrification in our reference case across end use cases, and we also see hydrogen playing an increasingly important role in the energy system with all the investment needs that come with it. We still expect roughly half of energy investments in 2035 to still go into oil and gas industry. So from an investment perspective, the energy transition is clearly moving on, but as mentioned before, fossil fuels continue to play an important role in the energy system in our reference case. And with that, I would like to hand over to Bram, who will give us an overview of the implications that our outlook has for CO2 emissions and the climate.
All right. Let me start with a perspective that I shared already. I've been receiving some feedback that sometimes the page transitions are not occurring very smoothly. I just want to make sure that everyone is looking now at a page that says projected CO2 emissions in the reference case remain far from a 1.5 degree consistent pathway. Is that?
Yeah, I certainly am, Bram, and I think most people are. But I know one or two people have had problems, but I think it is just one or two.
Okay.
Yes, and I think that people just need to refresh their browser if it happens. Okay.
Super. Thank you for that technical support. Much appreciated. Let me be also a bit descriptive in what we see then. So, if we look at the CO2 emissions that are associated with the outlooks that we just presented, we see the picture that I shared with you before. So the outlook in our reference case for CO2 emissions is that there will be a peak in the 2020s, then we'll see a gradual decline. The accelerated transition case actually leads to a bit stronger decline, but that's definitely very far from what one would need to see in order to end up at a 1.5 degree pathway. To give you a sense, our reference case probably can be associated with a 3.5 degree Celsius warming scenario of temperatures compared to pre-industrial levels by 2100. The accelerated transition has a bit lower emission profile and gets you to something like 2.5 degrees probably. Now, with that starting point, we then looked at what does it take to get to a 1.5 degree pathway. And sorry, before we go there, as a piece of context, we see more and more discussions actually and questions also from many of our clients who say, hey, if there's now such a big gap between, on the one hand, what you see in your reference case and accelerated transition scenario, and on the other hand, what would need to happen in a 1.5 degree world, how do we bridge those two? And we see that actually increasingly, of course, climate change, decarbonization are really top of mind for many of the policymakers, business leaders globally. And there's a couple of forces that we see are playing a role now and that are reinforcing each other. So we see corporate commitments, of course, of the energy majors over the past couple of years, but also of many companies that commits to deep decarbonization of their products with an impact throughout the supply chain. So Unilever making a statement on a strong decarbonization of their products that will have an impact throughout the supply chain that they use. The second factor is very important, is physical risk. And over the past 2-3 years, we've seen multiple examples of natural disasters, extreme events, extreme weather events that can be associated with climate change. And as we actually see temperatures rising already, and Alex commented earlier how we're at 1.1, 1.2 degrees of warming already, the expectation is that the prevalence actually of those events will increase. Then we see big shifts in the financial sector and also regulators, where increasing a number of financial institutions is actually pushing throughout their portfolio for deep decarbonization. And so this is no longer about how can I make 1 or 2 or 3% of my investments in green targets, but this is about how do I make my entire portfolio fully aligned with the objectives of a 1.5 degree transition. Finally, there's consumer engagement, of course, in many parts of the world where we see increasingly vocal groups requiring that shifts are being made. And of course, as a key enabler, also technological developments that oftentimes will actually make a transition towards lower carbon solution not only possible, but also the preferable choice because of cost, because of user preferences and so on. Then one other piece of context that we thought was actually very interesting, we see a growing number of countries that has strong decarbonization targets in place. And when we look at net zero targets, in other words, emissions that need to be on a net basis at zero by 2050 or 2060, more than half of the global emissions today comes from countries that have those targets in place. And if we add the US to that equation, where the new President Biden has made similar statements in this campaign, then actually we get to 2/3 of global emissions that are covered by those targets. Now, as I promised you earlier, we then looked at what does it take to get to a 1.5-degree pathway, and the brief answer is there's three important aspects that one needs to keep in mind. The first one is there's the notion of a cumulative carbon budget, and if you start counting at 2018, there's roughly 570 gigatons of CO2 that we've got left. And once you exhaust that budget, you reach, with a high likelihood, a warming level of 1.5 degrees. Now, the second part is you already in the very short term need to see that you reduce global emissions by more than half. So by 2030, a 1.5-degree pathway requires more than half of the global emissions are being reduced. And the third aspect that we see is by 2050, you actually need to be at net zero. So the net zero emissions that we spoke about on the previous page, the reason that they target net zero by 2050 is exactly that this is what it takes to get to a 1.5-degree pathway in that time frame. And net zero means then you can have some emissions left in very hard to abate sectors. We know that some of the heavier industries, think about iron and steel, cement, chemicals, are very difficult to decarbonize to the last percent. But all of those emissions will need to be compensated by negative emissions. And negative emissions can be accomplished through natural means, by planting forests on an annual basis, or by technological solutions. Think about carbon capture and storage or direct air capture, often in combination with biomass solutions as well.
Thanks, Bram. So I promised you in the introduction that I would also give a short glimpse on the European decarbonization pathway. I see that we are a bit out of time. I'll try to hurry up to leave some space for questions in the end. But now what Bram just presented is, we have to really, in order to get to a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, the world would have to speed up with emission decrease. And we have actually looked for Europe. What does that mean, right? This is a report that was just published before Christmas, where we had an in-depth look at the European economy, split into 10 regions, and created something that we call the cost optimal decarbonization pathway, where we really looked what are the technologies, etc., the costs, also the socioeconomic impacts that a net zero Europe by 2050 would imply. And I think first, and not further surprising, all countries and all regions in Europe would have to significantly speed up their decarbonization, right? Some regions have seen a reduction of emissions since 1990. Some others have seen a increase, but none of the regions have really seen a reduction in line with what it would take to get to 1.5 degree. Now, if we look at a scenario where we actually reach that net zero, the question becomes which sectors decarbonize how quickly and how much is it going to cost, right? There's certain sectors like, say, power and agriculture, where we actually, certain sectors like power and transport, where we see a relatively rapid decarbonization, given that the technologies that we need to decarbonize are largely known and in place. Power, we have renewables. Transport, we have electric vehicles that are proven at scale and strongly ramping up. And in many cases, this even saves cost, right? An electric vehicle is over its lifetime much cheaper to own and run than, for example, an internal combustion engine where you have to continuously purchase gasoline and so on. So those are sectors that are quote unquote easy to decarbonize. They have their own challenges, but those are the ones that we see decarbonize earliest. Then we have sectors like buildings, where some of the measures needed, especially energy efficiency, are actually cost efficient, so will probably happen fast, whereas others, for example, heat pumps, are not in the money, as we say, so they are quite expensive to do and will therefore happen later. So here we see a slower decarbonization. And then finally, industry, where we really see none of the things that need to happen in industry will save money. it will in most cases be more expensive to run the decarbonized technology here. Therefore, it will happen much slower and at a much higher cost. Now, it's a bit of a busy chart here, but stay with me. We asked the question, which of the technologies that we need for a full decarbonization will ramp up when? And I think it's quite striking that, you know, by 2030, the abatement that we would need to achieve could, like most of that, could actually be achieved with a really energy efficiency and electrification of end use, right? So with switching to electric vehicles, getting heat pumps in place, making sure that the occasions where we still use fossil fuels are done in a more efficient way can bring us a far way. And then only after 2030, really a few of the technologies that we will ultimately need in 2050 to get to net zero, but that are not really in place today, such as, for example, hydrogen or green hydrogen as fuel or feedstock, a significant amount of biomass or carbon capture and storage or usage. Those will play a role as well, but really only to get sort of to the really hard to abate parts of the energy system. So I guess the takeaway is really in the short term, a lot of the decarbonization needed to get to 1.5 degree can actually be done with technologies known today. Over time then, and I mentioned this, there's really a need for basically all of you, right? Some of the technologies that we will ultimately need in 2050 to decarbonize the energy system are today really very much in a research and design or in a demonstration phase, but not yet proven at scale or even in early adoption. And I think there's still a lot of role to play for the research community, but also for entrepreneurs to really make sure that those technologies are in place when they are needed in the next decades. Now coming to the cost of the transition. So again, a bit of a busy chart, but on the left-hand side is what we expect investments to happen in the energy system sort of in a reference case, right? Not getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius or to net zero in Europe, we would still have to invest some 28 trillion euro over the next 30 years to get just to keep the energy system alive. Getting to net zero would require 5.4 trillion additional investments. However, the operating cost of the energy sector, so you know all the fuels that need to be paid, etc., those would be reduced quite significantly. So you would have to invest a bit upfront, but then the operating costs are much lower. So that putting this together in a typical marginal abatement cost curve, where you have, you know, on the left all the technologies that actually lead to cost savings, and on the right all the technologies that actually require additional costs to reduce carbon emissions. If you sort of net the areas under the chart here, you'll get to more or less zero. So I think the key message here is that net zero Europe and the full decarbonization of the European economy can actually achieve at a net zero cost from a system perspective. And then this is the final chart of today. We also had a look, and I'm not going to ask you to go through every number here, but we had a look at what it actually now means for jobs. You know, moving away from fossil fuels, retiring quite a bit of infrastructure, and there will be a fair amount of stranded assets as well if you really want to achieve 1.5 degree. However, on the new technology side, you know, in the power sector, for example, or in the building sector, there would be a significant amount of jobs created. So that we estimate that net by 2030, some 2 million jobs could be created, and by 2050, some 5 million jobs Europe-wide. So I think the key takeaway here really is that, you know, a net zero Europe is possible at zero cost from a system perspective, and with a potential to create jobs. And with that, I think, Bram, want to give us a summary, and then we can hopefully spend some time on questions.
Super, thanks, Alex. Now, let me keep this very short, actually, and then why don't we just leave the summary page on the screen for a while, but in the meanwhile, let's actually open it up for questions, just to give you some time for open dialogue also, as promised. If you want, share your questions through the meeting chat. There is one question that I saw there that I wanted to already pick up on, which is what is now actually this role of gas, and why is it relatively robust throughout a large part of this period? And I think one aspect that's important to comment on there is natural gas in the past decades has seen strong growth, in large part because we've seen a coal to gas switch, and in second because we've seen that actually fast growth countries in terms of power demands have been ramping up their gas capacity. Now, in the next 15, 20 years, we'll see that the role of gas in those energy systems, in those power systems in particular, is going to shift from a baseload provider, meaning plants run 80, 90% of the time, to a flexibility provider, meaning gas will much more play a role of an enabler of the uptake of intermittent renewables, and you'll simply have your gas plants around to cover the spells that there is not enough solar or wind power available. Now, against that backdrop, we actually see that also when you see a bit of an accelerated transition, there will also be an incremental need for flexibility if renewables uptake actually further accelerate. And that's one of those dynamics that we see play out, such that the impact that an accelerated transition in the way that we've modeled it here has on gas demand is actually meaningfully different from what we see in oil demand, where indeed we see much more of a substitution, where in transport oil gets replaced by power, partially by hydrogen, as we've seen, and in other parts of the system we see maybe biofuels increasingly play a role, or synfuels in aviation. With that, Alex, you wanna pick up one of the questions that we see?
Shall I take us through the questions, Bram? Because I've been logging them as they came in.
Absolutely.
Yes, please.
And I'm going to exercise. So what I want, when I ask someone, identify someone's question, please switch on your camera and mic, and you can ask the question yourself in your own way rather than me asking it. I'm going to, while people prepare to do that, I'm going to start with sort of chair's privilege of asking you a pretty high level question. I mean, what you've shown is that your reference scenario, based on what your business clients think, is a huge distance away from the 1.5 degrees scenario that all our governments signed up to. That doesn't surprise me, and I don't suppose it surprises many people on this call that there's that big difference. Are your governmental clients aware that what they've signed up to on what they're actually doing are not really compatible?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think in a way this holds true not only for governmental actors but also for corporate actors, right? Many of whom actually have made similar commitments over the past 5 years. I think what we see is that since signing of the Paris Agreement at the end of 2015, we've seen actually 5 years where the world has been gradually moving in terms of its realization, in terms of its awareness of what it meant to commit, subscribe to 1.5 degree targets. And in many of those cases, we've actually been part of those conversations where we worked with clients and shared perspectives like the one that we've presented to you today, to exactly also illustrate that gap between what we see happening and to be honest, what we call our reference case, if you compare that to many of the other reference case type scenarios, and some call it a base case and some call it a business as usual, but many of those, or compared to many of those, we are actually on the forward-leaning side, right? But even then, indeed, we see a very significant gap, and that's often part of the conversation that we have, where many of the, I think, governments that we see today are asking themselves the question, how do we now bridge that gap? Exactly that. And we see that the European Union has been taking a bit of a front runner role over the past couple of years, and it's really the past 1.5, 2 years that they did that with the European Green Deal. We see similar debates occurring now in the US and in other places, but I think that's actually a gradual development, but with the speed of travel that suggests that stronger decarbonization is coming up over the next couple of years if all of those conversations and aspirations continue to increase.
Thanks, Bram. So the first couple of questions I'm going to take are from Kingsmill Bond and Pietro Altamat. Just before I take Kingsmill, Bram, Alex, can I just check you can stay until 5:15? Because I think we'll probably need that to get through the questions.
That's the good.
Yeah, right. Okay, Kingsmill, over to you. This is about your modelling philosophy. Hi, Kingsmill, are you there? Nope. I'm not hearing you, Kingsmill, so I'm going to move on to Pietro. Pietro, you've got a bunch of questions, but if you can try and pose them as one, that would be helpful.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I like very much that you show the big gap between the promised CO2 mitigation that's actually necessary. What I miss is actually a 1.5 Celsius scenario that doesn't decline as deeply in the next 5 years, because that's actually not necessary. So if you look at your slide 14, I mean, your 1.5 scenario, if you could show slide 14, please, just declines very, very steeply from like COVID, you know?
Yep.
And when you calculate your 550 gigatons or even 800 gigatons, you could actually wait for longer but decline faster afterwards. So my general impression is that you have lots of linear models, but things won't progress linearly. They will progress in rates, and it all looks so linear. What do you do? So why is it so linear?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Pietro, and thank you also for bringing that up. Let me share two reflections here. The first one is on the trajectory of this curve, and we get this quite a lot. So what we did for our 1.5 degree pathway was we particularly focused on 2030 and 2050 as key points in time. And what we then started to find, and in part that was actually one of our key findings, is the degrees of freedom that you have in order to stay within the carbon budget are not that large, right? So it's we're with you. You can wait a couple of years, right? And compared to what we show here, you probably have to model that you wait a couple of years, because even with COVID, we saw a 7% decline, but we don't see the structural shift in energy systems that would be required to make that a continuous trend. But if you do so, indeed, you have to then see that after 5 or 10 years, you see a much steeper drop in emissions. And in fact, to stay within that budget of 570 gigatons, that drop would really need to be much steeper still than what we see here. Now, we had a lot of debates around, how likely is that? In a way, we refer to that as you can go for an orderly transition, which we try to capture here. You can also go for a much more abrupt shift, right? Which is likely to happen, for example, when governments start to be confronted with implications of climate change, and then from one day to the next shift radically their energy policies. And we've seen some examples, of course, in the past decade of governments, for example, when it comes to nuclear, from one day to the other, shifting their philosophy and making radical shifts. Something like that you could see at a larger scale. But as we think that through, we also realize that such an abrupt shift actually would lead to a much more disruptive transition also, and much more disruptive shifts in the roles that different industries play in the economy and so on.
I think we need about 20% growth, say, of PV and wind. If you calculate the 20% growth, it's nice, it's disruptive, and it actually fulfills our climate goal. So all you need is a non-linear model. It's a model based on rates, on growth rates, and not on linear, like you are used to from oil industry, etc., isn't it?
Yeah. So in terms of the linearity of the models that we use, I think there is definitely a linear aspect to this, to the extent that we work with our deep understanding of, let's say, how the iron and steel sector works today, right? And the relation, the correlation between economic growth and the amount of steel that you need. But at the same time, in a way that we capture potential shifts, actually that's quite nonlinear because of the aggregation or the multiplication actually of multiple effects at the same time, right? So we model demand reduction on the one hand, we model electrification shift on the other, we model a sharp uptake of renewables at the same time, right? And the aggregate effect of all of that actually will play a strongly nonlinear role, we think.
I would say it's linear times a multiplication factor. And even when you look at how fast, I mean, you showed it, how fast cracking increased in the US. It was, I think, 8-fold or something. This is not linear at all.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't describe if you model what happened in the US with fracking, could you? So why shouldn't nonlinear things happen in the future with CO2 mitigation?
Yeah, and I'm fully with you actually that we're conscious of that potential bias. We have a lot of discussions on how to mitigate it, right?
Yeah.
but also are aware that in a lot of these approaches there is a linear element. We try to also do some of the more radical sensitivity analyses, I would say, that go in a much more nonlinear direction. But happy actually to reflect on that a bit further, actually.
Okay, thank you. I pass on questions to other.
Thanks, Bram. Yeah, let's move on to other questions. We got a question from Tom Cassidy about, which I don't fully understand. So, Tom, I'm going to get you to ask it. It's about methane emissions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bram and Alex. Really interesting discussion. It was just really understanding. So I guess methane emissions through the gas supply chain, in particular as a result of sort of LNG, the development of LNG and the increased methane emissions through that. That's gaining more scrutiny, largely down to the fact that methane emissions are sort of roughly 100 times more impactful on a ton per ton basis than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. Does any of your, first of all, do you think that's a sideshow? Is that at all relevant in terms of accounting for natural gas as a sort of transition fuel? Is that going to gain more scrutiny? And two, if it does gain more scrutiny and is an issue, how does that impact natural gas's role as a transition fuel?
Yeah. So it's a very good question, right? And you're right. Methane is a much stronger climate pollutant than CO2 in the short run, at least. So I would argue it is a very important problem to tackle. Especially the fugitive emissions from the gas networks and from the production and so on. However, in the long run, looking through 2100, assuming that the use of fossil fuels is reduced in the way that this 1.5 degree scenario that we looked at implies, and very importantly, that on the way there we haven't triggered any tipping points in the climate system. I would say that is not as important as reducing CO2 emissions that stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years.
Thanks, Alex. Let's move on to a question from Mitch Groves. Mitch, I think this picks up on the point about government and policy action.
Yeah, I mean, you guys can feel free to answer my question, which was, I'll just scroll up so I can remember it. I think it was to do with, here we go. Do you not think government policies will become more aggressive as the scale of the climate crisis is realized, especially what you guys were talking about when you said the accelerated transition scenario would hit 3.5 degrees. But I feel as if that was probably answered by Pietro's comment, by Pietro's question. So you guys can feel free to answer it, but you don't have to if you don't want to either.
Maybe, Bram, do you want to?
Let me, my one addition maybe that I would have is this is an important area, right, that we're watching in order to better understand where this transition is going to move over the next couple of years. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is a growing number of governments actually becoming increasingly ambitious in terms of their decarbonization efforts and ambitions. The question now is, will they follow through and indeed also introduce regulations, laws, right, and specific initiatives to start moving in that direction? And is that what we're going to see in the next 10 years? Or are we going to see a different development, right, where actually there's a continued gap between ambitions on the one hand and realizations on the other, and that remains to be seen. And I think that makes it one of the reasons that this is a tremendously interesting area also to be active in and to watch, of course.
Thanks, Bram. I've got a couple more questions in the chat, and I think when we've had those, we'll close the session. So the questions are the first one's from Jan Mangel, and after Jan, we'll take one from Tom Russell. Jan, yours is about gas demand, but I think also a little bit on something that was touched on earlier about potential bias in McKinsey's client base. Jan, are you there?
Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
Thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Good. Yes. Yeah, it's really about the bias. And the reason I asked this question is I've had a long career with Chevron, doing this kind of modeling and, working with companies like McKinsey and other companies. There is a serious, bias there that we try to mitigate. So how do you deal with that bias as a company, McKinsey work, when most of your clients, are these oil companies, your important clients? And it's just quite intriguing that I know the oil companies are shifting to gas, desperately shifting to gas, and then your analysis, your 20%, which I believe you're proposing, kind of sticks with gas. So how do you handle those biases that your company would have because of its clients?
Yep. Thanks for that question, Jan. And it's an important topic. So when we started building the models that we described to you, and we described to you basically the level of detail that we went to construct this, one of our key objectives was actually to build a tool that was flexible and transparent in terms of what the assumptions are. And that's also very much what we do when we use this to work with clients. So it's what we often see is that many other forecasters have perspectives that are relatively close, relatively black box. What we try to do with our clients and what we actually do based on the work that we do on an everyday basis is give full transparency on what are all of the assumptions that feed into the models. What is the methodology that we use in order to then say, let's now build bespoke scenario perspectives that reflect the beliefs and the perspectives of our clients. And of course, when you work with a client in some of the energy industries versus a client that's a very forward-leaning investor, what those assumptions are can be significantly different, right? And in reality, what we oftentimes see is that we build multiple scenarios to also test some of the key sensitivities. But so at the core, we've built these models and also the software suites around them in order to provide that flexibility and transparency. And in the work that we then report, we try to do something similar, right? So we try to be relatively open about some of the key ingoing assumptions, but also some of the key reasons why we see gas is likely to play a role for longer, but also why we see that actually oil demand is going to peak, and what are some of the key drivers behind it.
Thank you.
I would also add to this that this bias could be interpreted in both ways, right? So because McKinsey is not only serving oil and gas clients, but also many clients that are sort of on the other side of this. So when we build this perspective, we talk to I would say upwards of 100 experts across McKinsey globally that work in all sectors, right? And you can have very interesting discussions whether you talk to, let's say, a partner in the Houston office or a partner in the Silicon Valley office. So there will be very different perspectives, and what we as a team do is that we capture and collect all of these perspectives and then build our independent view of what we believe, given what we know today, where this is going. And I personally find that you can, based on these on this outcome, on this published scenario, you can have very important and relevant discussions with clients, especially also when you disagree on the outlook. And I have had many of these, and those are usually quite fruitful discussions, especially when you don't agree on the outlook.
Thank you.
Thanks both. Let's go for a last question then about costs and benefits to Tom Russell. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, I was nicely surprised by this. Oh, it's very difficult to hear you.
Tom, it's very faint. You're very faint.
Is that any better?
Yeah, there's a bit of a buzz, but that's definitely better.
Okay, sorry about the buzz. The net zero for net zero cost kind of headline at the end sounds like very good news. And I wondered if any other benefit cases would be particularly convincing to tilt policy or business decisions towards that 1.5 degrees pathway. So I'm thinking of things like reduced risks from climate hazards or other well-being or environmental co-benefits. You mentioned job creation in your bullet point 6 as well. So what works?
I think the comment, Tom, and thanks a lot for the question. The comment that you make on risk is a very important one. So what we see actually is that quite quickly an increasing number of companies and also countries is thinking about climate and transition in the context of risk assessment, right? And that's physical risk, but it's also very much transition risk. So if we now see that the way that the world thinks about the direction of travel for our energy systems, if that way of thinking is shifting quickly, what does that mean for how I'm exposed to some of the shifts that might be happening, right? So if I'm fully dependent on some of the fossil fuels that in a 1.5 degree world actually are going to see a quick drop in demand, what does that mean for my exposure to such a transition, right? And what will my strategy therefore need to look like for the decades to come? So I think the combination of physical climate risk and transition risk is a very important one. And in a way, there's different ways that you can think about it. But if you start from the notion that if we continue on the current path, we are going to see an accelerated degree of global warming with all the negative repercussions that it will have, right? In such a world, yeah, we see that an increasing number of stakeholders is actually starting to shift towards trying to avoid that. And that means that the whole notion of countries and companies making the shift by itself becomes also in a way a self-reinforcing factor.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to Bram and Alex. Before we close the session, I just would like to do a quick advert for next week. Next week's speaker is Nicole Miranda from the Smith School and from the Oxford Martin programme on the future of cooling. And Nicole's going to be talking about the future of cooling and its links to sustainable development goals. So I think that'll be a really interesting session. Let me just end then by thanking all of you for coming. As usual, we got a series of challenging questions to put our speakers on the spot and keep them on their toes. And most of all, thanks to Bram and Alex for what is a hugely comprehensive presentation and dealing with those challenging questions. Myself, I've just been working on looking back at a 30-year projection that I was involved with 30 years ago. Yes, I am that old. So I'm making a mental note to myself here that the Oxford Energy Network should invite you to guys back in 30 years' time to look at what has actually happened in 2050 and how close you were in 2021. That would be a really interesting session, but I think it'll be a future successor rather than me involved in doing that. Thanks very much again for such a great session, Alex and Bram, and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for joining.
Great pleasure. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. You find the contact info on the screen right now. And
right.
thanks for the invitation, Nick. We'll mark it in our calendar. I don't know what technology we use for calendars in 2051, but we'll try to be there.
Great. Okay. Bye.